Hi guys, Sandy here. We're going to talk about a sew-along with McCalls 7562. Now I made version C. I thought this was a really cute little summer dress. I have a rayon that I got from Elliott Berman when they had their big sale at the beginning of the summer, and this is the version that we're going to do. So I taped and photographed as I've gone along, and I want to give you a little rundown of what we did. So the first thing you need is your pattern pieces. Here we go. And you're going to need piece 1, which is the front, piece 5, which is the back, piece 6, which is the neck binding, and that's on the bias cut. We want to make sure that that's cut on the bias. Piece 7 is for the collar. It has this little split in the collar right here. I did not use piece 7. I did my own method, and I will show you that. Piece 8 is the pocket. Piece 9 is the tie that goes on the sleeve, and piece 11 is the hem facing. So those are all the pieces that you need. You need to cut them, and you also need to cut an interfacing for 11C. All right, and then let us begin. Step 1. Step 1. Fold this down so you can see it. All right. Step 1, here we go. They want you to reinforce this little split here in the fabric, and then they want you to cut an angle. Now, since I didn't use their method to make this facing, I did not do this step. Certainly, if you want to use their method, you can. I find that their method ends up with this messy inside, and the fabric structure is compromised. So I don't particularly like to use McCall's method for doing the facing. I've done it a couple of times, and I don't find that it comes out well. I find that it does not come out well. So I said that better. All right, next step is pocket for view A. We're not doing that. So that takes us all the way over to here, step 13. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew from the neck edge to the little dot. Now, that is only a couple of inches, and you can see on here it's pretty small. And for me, it was a little too shallow, so I extended that seam a little bit more. So here is the neck edge right here, and this seam they had you sew to about here, from here to here, which I thought for me was just, it wasn't enough. I threw it on and it was way too much arm, so I added like another 3 inches to it. So it's about 5 inches long instead of the 2.5 inches that they had you sew right here. So that is a style issue. Certainly you can make it whatever length you want. It doesn't change the pattern at all. Now the next step is the neck binding, and they want you to stay stitch the neck. Now, all the seams on here, except for the little seam on the pocket when you apply it to the front and the back, all the seams are 5/8 of an inch. Now, stay stitching around this neck edge is really important because some of these areas are on the bias, and you want to make sure that they're not going to be shifting around. So you want to, don't skip this step. It just takes a minute, and it will make you much happier in the long run. You don't want a wobbly neck. And then they want you to take the neck binding, which is piece C, and fold it wrong sides together along itself and press it. Now this you cut on the bias, and it needs to be stretchy because it's going to go around the curve, so it needs to be cut on the bias. So that's step 14 and 15, and that takes us to page 2, which would be right here. All right. Pin binding to neck edge, matching centers, and stitch. Stretching binding to fit. Now the binding is constructed so it's smaller than the neck edge. And the goal of the binding is to take that neck edge and kind of just tighten it up a little bit and suck it in, keep it from wobbling around. And what that does is it keeps it laying, keeps that nice edge laying closer to your skin. If the binding is the same length as the neck edge, the same area, then it gets ruffly and it doesn't have that really nice control. And you'll see that's the difference between something that looks like ready to wear and something that looks like homemade. And you want to avoid that homemade look for the most part. I mean, sometimes it is a look that you're looking for, but in general, you want it to look more like a really nice ready to wear garment. That means that the bias binding that you put around the neck needs to be a little bit smaller than the neck edge itself, so it'll just kind of suck it in. Now, They have you stitching, trim seams to 3/8 of an inch. You sewed them at 5/8, trim to 3/8, press seam towards binding. What they do not have you do is clipping these round edges, and I think that that's something that you really should do. It's going to make a difference in the way that your binding comes around your neck edge. So here is my neck edge binding. It was sewed on, then pressed up and around and over, and so the seam is pushed up into the binding, and then I hand stitched this all the way around. So that gives you a really nice neck edge, and you can see it's a little bit bigger. The dress is a little bit bigger than the binding, and that's because we want the binding to lay really nice close to our skin, so that's important. Okay, step 18. Now this is the finishing of the neckband, the little V right here in front. So this is going to finish that off. This is their method. I used my own method. They basically want you to take two pieces and sew them together, and you have a little overlap. The only problem is you end up with this really ugly little piece here, and the stability of the fabric is compromised because you have clipped into the corners before you've actually sewn this, and then you have this really ugly little tab on the inside. So I didn't use that method, and I'm going to put some photographs up. What I did do was and here's the finished dress. What I did do is I put a facing right sides together on this, stitched around the V, and you'll see that in the photographs, and then clipped it and turned it into the inside, and then I serged the edges and I trimmed them down. So you don't have a messy little tab down here floating around, and you have a nice finished edge on your V. It doesn't overlap. Unfortunately, that's the only thing, and if you really want the overlap look, then that's something that you should follow these directions. All right, the neck edge is all completed now, so now we're going to do our pockets. And you are going to stitch one pocket, section 8, to each front and back section in a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So make sure you use a 1/4 inch seam allowance and press the seam towards the pockets. So the front and the back want to lay flat. So you stitch this. Now you want to make sure that you line up these tabs. That's really important, because when you sew the dress together, you want to make sure that when you sew the front and back together, they're the same distance from here to here, where the pocket starts and the underarm the same distance. So it's really important to match those notches. Sew this a 1/4 inch and then press the seam toward the pocket. So it looks just like this, right? So you have 4 of those. You're going to do 1 on each side of the front and 1 on each side of the back. Great, no problem. Then we're going to go to step 25. We're going to stitch the front to back together at side and lower sleeve edge, leaving opening between large circles. All right, so you're going to start at this underarm, and you're going to stitch a 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way to that dot. And you want to back tack at that dot and back tack here under the arm. Then you're going to start at this dot, and you're going to back tack, and you stitch all the way to the hem, and you're going to do that on both sides. So now it's really starting to look like a dress. And we want to baste the pocket edges together at the side seams. So you want to just baste around the edge of the pockets just to keep them together, so when you sew them down, they're like one piece, and you don't get any rumples in there. Clip back seam allowances above and below pockets. So on the back side, you just want to clip through that seam allowance so you can actually open up that seam. Right, it'll lie flat, so you can open it up and press it. All right, now you're going to turn the pocket towards the front along the seam line, press, and it has you baste the pockets in place along the seam line. You can certainly do that. I pin basted mine. You can hand baste it. That's just to keep this from wobbling around when you sew the pocket down, because you're going to sew the pocket actually right down to the fabric. All right, then you top stitch the pocket along the basting as shown. Now, when you top stitch that pocket, I top stitched mine from the inside, and if your bobbin and your top stitch, your top thread, have a good tension, then you can stitch it from the bobbin with the top up and the bobbin down, and it will be perfectly fine. So what you want to do is you want to lay a ruler or some kind of hard surface on your table, and I have a little square here. I would use my big table in between your front and your back, because you don't want to catch the back in this whole process. So see, I have my back in there. I just want the front. And here are my seams. They've been clipped, right? So this is how this opens, and I had basted this, And then what I did was with this underneath, I pinned my pocket down so it was nice and flat, right? All the way around to the front, and then stitched, and I just used the edge of the pocket as a guide. So I stitched all the way around both of these pockets. And what happens is, and on the black on black, you can't see it, but if you had a coordinating fabric, you would see that, and it's stitched down on the right side. So that keeps your pocket from flopping around. Love these pockets. And with the black, you can't really see the stitching. I think on another fabric, you might be able to see the stitching, and then you have to make that kind of a decision. Does your thread match really well? Is it something you actually want to see? Because you're going to see those two big pockets in the front. All right. So our pockets are done. Woohoo! Pockets are done. We finished this. Our pockets are done. Reached the ties. We're going to do view C, turn in 1/2 inch seam allowance on long edges and end without symbols of tie and press. So on one end of the tie, here's my tie. On one end of the tie, you need a finished edge. On the other end, you do not. So you need to fold that edge over. Then I fold mine in half, wrong sides together, and press it, because when I open it up, it gives me a line right down the middle. There's a picture here. And then I can fold in my 1/2 inch seams and then fold it in half again and press. And then what you want to do is you want to stitch the edges. Now you can stitch down one side across the bottom and back up. I like to stitch off, so I stitch off, then I stitch across all the way off and then back up again. And you want to use a really scant 1/4 inch. I have an edge stitcher, so I used that, but if you don't, you want to use a really thin 1/4 inch. All right, so we've stitched it. Now we're going to place it on the sleeve, and you want to make sure that you paste the raw edge on the raw edge of the sleeve, and it's going out because we're going to turn this hem, and when we do that, that will bring the tie to where it's supposed to be. All right, then we're going to make a narrow hem along the remaining shoulder on upper sleeve edge. All right, tapering to nothing above the large circle. Pivot across the circle, seam allowance 1/4 inch above large circle when stitching. All right, so basically what you're going to do, let's see, where's my shoulder? This is my shoulder. I serged mine and just folded it once, but if you don't have a serger, you can do a double fold, right? And when you fold it, that gets this flops out, and you stitch it all the way up here and cross. You open up this seam and you stitch to a point, or you can stitch across and then stitch back down again, and then here's the tie on the other side. So now you have a sleeve with an opening and ties at the bottom. All right, and then the next step is going to be to finish this hem of the sleeve, this bottom edge, and I did the same thing. I just serged it and folded it over. You could double fold it if you don't have a serger. What you're looking for is a square here, so this tie runs right along the edge of the hem, and then there's a nice square edge along the edge of the sleeve, and that will, that will give you, now my dress is inside out, that will give you this really nice split here on the seam. It's well done, and then goes all the way down, and you have a tie at the bottom, and the edge of the hem is all finished. So I think that that is a really nice little detail. And now we talked about this in the beginning, about how long this was. If this was shorter, this opening would be longer. You know, it's the same process. The opening is just a little bigger. And that's just a style decision. You know, everybody has their own style. I wanted a little more coverage. Some people might not have a problem with that. All right, so there's the ties. Here's the narrow edge of the hem. So we're done through 33. These are all for view B, view B, view B. Let's see. View C, here we go. So now we're all the way down to the hem. You have piece 11. You want to use iron-on interfacing. I like an interfacing with a stretch. I think that even though this is a woven and it's a rayon, it has some forgiveness to it, and it gives the fabric some softness. You want to use a really light interfacing. This is really just to give it a little bit of stiffness. It gives the dress a little bit of body, so when you're wearing it, it doesn't like suck up into your knees. It helps it float away from the body a little bit. All right, fuse interfacing to wrong sides of front and back line facing following the manufacturer's instructions. That's pretty easy. All right, then you're going to sew these together, right? Sew the edges together, stitch the facing front and back together at the sides. And you are going to finish the edge of the facing. I actually serged mine. I have to find the edge of my dress. I actually serged the edge of mine, the edge that I'm not sewing to the dress. I serged this. Then you're going to apply it to the dress, right sides together. So if you have the right side of your dress and turn the facing in, and it's a very weird little contraption, but if you haven't done it before, it's a little different. Once you make a hem like this, you're going to love it. You're going to absolutely love it, especially where there's a curve in it. So you've attached this. Now it tells you with right sides together, pin facing to lower edge, stitch, trim, under stitch. So it has you trim. I serged mine. It does not tell you to clip. And once again, you want to clip these circular edges. It's very important because what you're going to end up with on the side seam is this really pretty curve here. And if you want this curve to lay flat, you need to trim that seam allowance underneath. And when you clip it, you trim it and clip it, what happens is you clip a hole in there. When the curve happens, the fabric has a place to go. It moves. If the fabric isn't clipped, you're going to get a bump there because there's nowhere for the fabric to go. So this gives you a really smooth line, so that's definitely important. And then understitching is also key, and they have you do that here. And what that is you take the seam allowance and you press it towards the facing, and then you stitch really close to the seam on the facing. And what happens is it holds, you can see this stitching is really, here's my facing, and I've understitched it right here next to the edge. And what it does is it gives you a really nice roll because it holds the facing to the seam allowance. You don't see the stitching on this side, but you see the stitching on this side, and it gives it a little bit more structure and stability. And it makes it easier to hem and roll. Then you're just going to hem it. You're going to pin it, press it, pin it, and then I hemmed it again from this side, making sure it was equidistant from the hem. You can't see the black stitching very well on this fabric, which works in my favor, but if you have a contrasting fabric, contrasting thread, or the thread that doesn't match your fabric perfectly, then you're going to have to be a little bit more careful about your stitching, and that's something that is really important to do. Okay, so this dress is completed. Now, when I tried the dress on, I liked it a lot, except it was too big. And I found that that seems to be a problem for me with McCalls, is that from here to here, it's too big. And the neck edge was way too big for me. So I had a couple of options. I could take the whole dress apart, which I wasn't interested in doing. But what I did do was shorten these shoulder seams an inch, and that helped tremendously. When I make the dress again, and I do like the dress, when I make the dress again, I will shorten up the pattern. So this is my binding, my neck edge binding. I unpicked all of this hand stitching about that far, okay? Then I did a pivot. I stitched from here to about an inch up here. And let me show you on the pattern where that is. All right, so let me show you what I did. What I did was I started at the shoulder seam here, at the neck edge here, and I made kind of a wider line. So my stitching line went more like this. Okay, so that took up an inch. There was an inch there that I took up on each side. And then I went back and folded my facing over. Oh, that's the hem. I went back and I folded my facing back over again, and I stitched it. Now, I do have a seam in my facing, but you can't see it. So that was fine. I think it was a fine edit for this particular dress. Next time I won't do that. I will make sure I shorten it ahead of time. So that took care of the neck edge problem being too big. The next issue I had was that you don't see it with this dress, but on this dress you can see it. This armhole is huge. It's so big. See down here, look at how big that is. So every time I lifted my arm, you could see right through the dress, which for me doesn't appeal to me. So I wanted to shorten up this a little bit, to shorten up that opening. So I shortened it up about 1 inch. And what I did, I'm going to show you here. This is where you sew the seam, right? The side seams. What I did was I started 1 inch above the seam I had already sewn, and I blended it back into that dot because the pockets were there and I didn't want to destroy the pockets. So I would have had to take the pocket out to make this whole seam smaller and make the pocket look right, and it was already stitched down. It was way too much work. So this worked for me. I just made that a little bit bigger, made that seam a little bit bigger, which shortened up this opening here. All right, so that took care of that. The last issue I had was that this circumference was way too big. So I used the measurement on the pattern, and it said that the circumference for the size I picked was going to be 52 inches, and it was actually like 54 inches, so that it just made it way too big. So I took a couple of French darts in the back, and I took some fisheye darts. So what those are those are darts. I took them right here in the back. And they're an internal dart, so they have a point on each end and they get wider in the middle. And let me show you. I measured from the center back, and then I measured the center back, and then I measured out, so this is the center back, and then I measured out 4 inches from the center back. And then from there, I made, these are 12 inches long, and you see how they come to a point, but they're 1 inch, like 2 inches here in the middle. So it took in quite a bit. So it took in 4 inches. I took in 2 inches on each side, almost 2 inches. So you start at a point, gets wider, and back at a point. And these are equidistant from the center, and they are about, down from the edge, they are 8 inches, 8.5 inches down from the neck edge. So for me, that worked really well. And it just cinched in the waist a little bit in the back. You could also put them in the front if you wanted to, but the pockets are there, and I decided that that wasn't going to be the best solution. So the dress is a little loose on me. It's a little baggy. It's probably not my best look, but I think next time when I make it, and I will make it again, I think it's a really cute dress, and I absolutely love this rayon from Elliot Berman. I will make the sides, I'll go down a size. I'll shorten up the shoulders and go down a size in the dress because it's just too loose. It is a loose fitting dress, but it's just absolutely too loose. But that is our sew along for McCalls 7562. It's a fun little summer dress, and the summer's just leaving us here in New England, so I might have a chance to wear it once or twice, maybe with a little jacket, although you lose all of this really cute sleeve detail, so that wouldn't be the best way to use this dress. So here we go, McCalls 7562. A little sew along. Thanks for joining me. If this video was helpful and you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel, and you can visit me at barrettscustomdesign.com to sign up for my newsletter to find out when the next videos are coming along. And I hope to see you again. Go forth and sew what's fabulous. Bye.